Well, my earliest years were pretty much kind of a lonesome period because my father was away from home most of the time. And then shortly after that came the Korean War, and that Korean War devastated much of our lifestyle, and I was literally reduced to a orphan status. And so I had to survive on my own, going from door to door, begging for food. And food were very scarce in those days. And I recall many kids like me in those days who was equally unfortunate. We had to survive by digging into all the garbage dumps that came from military base nearby. And we will scoop bucket full of those, bones and whatever leftovers, make a soup, and that's how we survived. At that point, I was about 14 years old. Well, in my desperate attempt to survive, I decided I need to get some job. I went to an American military base in Suwon, California, not California, Suwon, Korea, and there I met American chaplain whose name was Chaplain Vida. He happened to be a Lutheran pastor assigned to Korea as a chaplain. For 2-3 days, I tried to talk to someone who might be able to give me a job. And I emphasized that I will do anything they ask me to do if they only give me some food to eat. Then the labor officer who told me, so can you speak English? I said, well, I really don't speak English well, but I can write. And so I wrote what my situation was. And then he said, do you like to work for a chaplain? And I said, well, I don't know what chaplain is, but I didn't want to risk by appearing to be ignorant. And so I said, oh, I love chaplain, but I'm not knowing who that is or anything, even the subject matter. I said, okay, then I'll take you there and you meet him, and if two of you agree, then you may get the job. He just came from America a few days before. So when I went there, he was trying many different ways to tell me who he is as a chaplain, and I couldn't understand. He knew that I was not understanding. Finally, he pointed to me in his military jacket. He had a cross on a lapel, and he said, do you know what this is? So I said, oh, you Christian? He said, yes. Do you like? I said, what alternative do I have? I am anxious, I'm hungry. So I said, yes. And then he says, well, do you go to church? Well, at that time, honestly, I did not go to church, but I had a Christian friend who always invited me to his church. He had a mission heart, so to say. But all the kids in the class made fun of him because he was only Christian in that area, and they were definitely a minority, and they were made fun of. I always felt kind of sorry for him. So just to do him favor, I said, okay, I'll go to church with you this evening. And they showed a movie called The King of Kings. And it was a fascinating movie. And so that's my first introduction to Christianity, through my classmate who was known as the oddball. And thereafter then, and because of that, I could identify with the Christian faith. And when this chaplain asked me if I was a Christian, I could say, yes, I went to church, meaning only once. But he took it to mean that I am a Christian. So even if we are miscommunicating, I firmly believe that God has something in mind and made it okay, that to the point where his mind was open, saw me as a possible candidate. And then he asked me, okay, what church? Now, I had no idea, many different denominations that existed at that time. And so I couldn't answer that question. And then he says, Presbyterian? Because he knew that in Korea, Presbyterian mission work began very early, and with people like Underwood. And so therefore, he assumed that that might be where I went. And I really could not tell, so I shook my head. And then he said, Methodist? Because they too were quite early in their ministry to Korea. Again, I could not answer. And then he finally said, Catholic? So in Korea, the word Catholic is still Catholic. So that I understood. So I answered, me, no Catholic. And then he says, good, that's what I want to hear. Because he was a Protestant chaplain, and he did not want a Catholic boy as his assistant or something like that, you know. So that's how then he took me in and become his helper from that day on. Well, one day he asked me if I would go with him to downtown to meet some of the poor people, and they might want to hear about America and also some Christianity with it. And so we went. He asked me to translate what he was saying, his message, and I was really not up to that point. My English proficiency was, very low. But nevertheless, what choice do I have? So I said, okay, I will do my best, if that's good enough. And he says, that's good. And after the speech, when I just guessed what he was saying and so on, who do you think was in the audience? One of the men comes forward and said to me and says, well, I am professor of English at Yonsei University, one of the very prominent Ivy League university. And I just literally froze. I knew that I was wrong, And then he looked at me and said, well, kid, you did okay. So I was relieved. But anyway, this is an interesting story, after which then he began to ask me, look at all these people who need the gospel. You should become a pastor yourself and serve people like this. The chaplain right away said that. And I said, no. My response was, I don't think so, because I don't know much about Christianity. And my parents never were. And in our family, there's no Christian. And he said, well, nobody's born Christian. You can learn. Well, how do I learn? Well, there was no Korean Lutheran seminary, because he was the Lutheran chaplain. He wanted me to study the Lutheran pastoral training. So then that in turn led him to say, okay, then you go to America and study and become a Lutheran pastor and come back and serve people here in Korea. And that will be good, because they don't have any Lutheran church now. That will be a good thing for you to do. So that's how then his recommendation went to some of our synodical colleges. So the first college that responded was St. John's College in Winfield, Kansas. So that's where I went. It was a marvelous experience. Those were the days when there was much less diversity in America. People like me were like a strange animal in the zoo. They all wanted to know more about me, and I had a wonderful opportunity to interact with them. They treated me so well, gave me generous scholarships from the college. Otherwise, I could not have made it. And so my memory of those days, a wonderful gratitude to the kind people. The culture was kind and gentle in those days. That was right after Second World War, of course. And people were all upbeat, optimistic. So I think I came to America in most idyllic time. And my experience is all very positive. But then that, in fact, preparation was made already when Chaplain and I were in Korea. He wanted to teach me more religion, so he used Martin Luther's Small Catechism. And my interest was not learning religion, but learning English. And he taught me English through Martin Luther's Small Catechism. So it met both needs, I suppose, so to say. And then he told me, since my English was still so poor, he wanted me to wait till I get to America, and while I'm going to college, that I should be baptized by receiving a detailed instruction from a Lutheran pastor in Winfield, Kansas, who happened to be, in fact, the pastor Zander, whose son then later became a missionary to Japan. I was baptized not in Korea because the chaplain knew that I was not understanding too much because of the English language shortage. And so he wanted me to know for sure what the content of the faith is. So he asked me to wait till I go to America, to the college that is at Winfield, Kansas. So I waited there until my freshman year in college, where a pastor of the Trinity Lutheran Church in town, Pastor Zander, baptized me. And it so happened that his son, Tom Zander, later on then went to Japan to become one of the early missionaries in Japan. Then I went to Concordia Senior College, and by that time, Dr. Neve, who was the head of the WWII education, and he wanted to change the system so that we will graduate with a BA rather than AA as it was before. And then when we go to seminary, then we will directly engage in a graduate study with finishing with the MDiv program rather than the BD. Well, I could say only by God's grace I survived. Because when I came to America, suddenly I remember having to learn, in addition to English, the German, because of our heritage, Greek, because I was a pre-sem student, and Latin, because the pre-sem requirement also. So I was all confused between all the different languages. But fortunately, I was able to complete all those language requirements. After seminary, I wanted to do some more graduate study simply because I was fascinated by the culture shock that I had experienced coming to America from such country like Korea, not well known then in the world scene. So I wanted to study more culture and society, so that my undergraduate major at the senior college was sociology. And then I proceeded to do that with the Washington University, which was located in St. Louis. So I already did some courses while I was also simultaneously enrolled in Concordia Seminary. And that's where I began my graduate study. And after that was finished, then I was ready to take assignment. Well, in fact, there were times, even prior to this, there were times that I thought I will not make it. So I remember going to the academic dean and saying, well, it was Dr. Wente in those days in the Winfield, where I said, Dr. Wente says, well, you have already finished 3 weeks, and so you have to stick with it, and I'll give you a tutor that can help you. And that happened to be Dr. Bowman, who was later president of the synod, but he was a St. John's grad. Also, he came there as a vicarage, education vicarage then, I suppose. So anyway, with his help, then I kept learning more and more English. And with that, then, this is Dr. Wente's encouragement that I feel, only by grace, I should say, because as for me, I wanted to quit. And I knew that I would not make it. But by the persistent help of the many people around me, I was able to go through. See, when chaplain first asked me whether I should go to America and prepare for the pastoral ministry, my immediate answer was no, because my father wanted me to be involved in politics like he was. He worked for the South Korean government. And my mother wanted me to be a medical doctor. For some reason, for her, that was an important profession. I myself wanted to be an atomic scientist. That was after the Second World War, when Hiroshima was bombed with the atomic bomb, awesome power. I thought that would be a neat study. So farthest from my mind was theology. And yet, you know, the Lord works with you in a mysterious way, that because of my terrible experience through the war, hunger, starvation, and uncertain the lives that often, you know, suddenly one moment everything's clear, next moment sirens running and houses leveled and bullets coming through and people bleeding everywhere, dying, and I was yet still alive. And this chaplain reminded me of that. And so you told me many stories about how life was so precarious that that bullet could have been for you. And yet, so in those days we had a saying that you cannot avoid the bullet. Bullet has to avoid you. And so why do you think God kept you alive? And I could not answer that. I said, and then he said, what is the purpose of your life after that? And I said, well, do I have to have a purpose in life? He said, I should. So all this conglomeration and the combination of the questions and challenge then made me to at least open my heart and see maybe he got something. That, you know, he was saying, you could have been one of those who just died. And so why do you think God kept you alive? That was just haunting question that I could not answer. I think even to this day, I'm not sure that I have a complete answer. But the answer that I subscribe to as a guideline for my life is the statement that the Apostle Paul made in 1 Corinthians, all things work together for good to those who love God. Everything turned out so far good, as far as I can see, not by my own effort, but because of God's grace. So I wanted to learn more. So I enrolled in a doctoral program in sociology. So that lengthened my study time. And so in those days, a lot of people were anxious, when am I going to be finished so that I can go back to Korea and fulfill the initial motivation and the reason for which I came to America. You know, my purpose was to become an ordained pastor and go back to Korea and become a pastor there. But that was kept delaying. And then by the time I finished, the time has elapsed. And the missionary, by that time, our Lutheran Church in Missouri Synod sent the missionaries to Korea. 3 missionaries to begin with, the Pastor Voss and Bartling and Doro. Those 3 were the pioneers who went to Korea as the first missionaries. And then they in turn worked very hard, very successfully to establish their own seminary there. And so they will begin to produce the pastors there, native pastors. And so when I wrote to them and said, I'm ready to come by after the finishing my graduate studies, they thought that maybe they have enough the personnel and manpower there, and it is not a good time for me to come back. They encouraged me to stay here and do some other work first. And so then, just so happened that also Concordia Senior College, where I earlier mentioned where it went, was looking for a sociology prof, and their policy is not to have any professor of sociology that does not have the pastoral background also, so that we can properly balance faith and society. So they then approached me and said, we heard that you're not going back to Korea, so how about coming back and teach for us at the Fort Wayne? And that's how it all began. And I recall how disappointed I was at the time, because my goal was to go back to Korea. And here, maybe I'm not good enough to go back to Korea and effectively work in that context. So I took it almost as a rejection. And then my attitude changed when I went to different churches on Sunday mornings. They asked me to come and preach for them in vacancies, or a mission festival in those days were very big. And then people had a lot of questions. They wanted to know more about the mission field overseas and so on. And then suddenly it dawned on me that maybe the time has come where the mission work is no longer from west to the east, but maybe east should have some mission work at the west too. And so that gave me a sort of justification and consolation for me to continue to pursue that the endeavor. Those will happen to coincide with all this diversity emphasis that occurred, where the Time magazine, remember so many years ago, published cover where it said the West Coast, Los Angeles area is now a new Ellis Island. And that talk was a real lively conversation. And I said, okay, I'm in Fort Wayne, Indiana, but, you know, this is a new mission field anyway, because mission, instead of our going to far reaches of Asia or Africa, mission field came to our backyard. So what a wonderful opportunity we have. Well, it so happened that Dr. Charles Mansky had a vision that because West Coast is now New Ellis Island, future is a Pacific Rim, no longer Atlantic Rim, but the Pacific Rim. And he invited me because he is planning, at the time we didn't have the college, but planning at Christ College Irvine. He wanted to say the name should be Christ College because it is dedicated to the name of Christ, his Great Commission. That when he mentioned the Great Commission, that really resonated with my own idea of our mission. And so, you know, what is it? So it was during, I remember Christmas time, I utilizing that period from Fort Wayne. I came out here, and he showed me around, and it was just a whole new world. I said, why didn't I know all this? There were about 300 Korean ethnic churches already in LA area, and here we haven't heard about this. And so what are we doing as a Lutheran Church in Missouri Synod? We have the heritage. We have a Reformation tradition. We got solid teaching. Why are we not the ones who are capitalizing on all this immigrant that is pouring in? And if we already have 300 Korean churches, we should be, you know, among them. So that really gave me a great awareness, awakening in a way. So that motivated me to accept the call to Christ College Irvine then, since, of course, we grew up to change the name to become Concordia University Irvine. That I was also surprised that there was no Lutheran church in the midst of so many Korean immigrant churches. And so I went to the district office and knocked at the door and said, why is it that we don't even have one mission here? And district said that they never even, at that time, had anybody knocking at the door. And so we said, well, how about at least begin with one mission station in LA, the downtown LA. And then where do we get the pastors to do this? District very open-hearted at that point. And so I went to the seminary. There was one Korean gentleman, Pastor Young Hwan Hong, who came here to do some advanced supplemental graduate study. And so I told him, it's very important that we begin this ethnic ministry in America And so would you please come to LA and begin our first Korean mission station? And he accepted the challenge. And our district then sent him a call and to begin the ministry right at the center of downtown, Trinity Lutheran Church. That's the oldest church in Southern California district then. And that's where we also then situated our first ministry among the Koreans. After that, we had nobody else, And so what do we do now? And then necessarily that developed into a discussion of how do we train more Korean Lutheran pastors. And so a suggestion was made that we have a colloquy program. So we met at St. Louis. I remember Dr. Westcott then was a mission director, exec. And a few other people were also working. Len Holmes, the Leanerts, and Holmes, Len Holmes. We came together, only a few of us in the college and so on, and say, authorize for us, make it official for us, endorse what we call Korean Ministry Conference. And through their mechanism, we will take responsibility to train those who are already pastors by education at another denomination, but who is willing to come and learn about the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod through the colloquy program. And then after successful exit interview, they will be certified as Lutheran pastors and rostered in our church. And that system then came into being already for the last about 40 years or so. About so far, the raw number is about 64 classes finished the program, of which some are already retired because so many years ago, and they're already of age, some of them, by the time they converted to Lutheran.
So you thought you were going to be the missionary, and it ended up that you became the trainer of missionaries in the United States.
Well, that was a very humble beginning, and we are still struggling because we are self-supporting enterprise. We have absolutely no budget. We just do it with the people getting together, and when they come from New York, Texas, and so on, then they are all housed among us, and then we feed them with the different churches around here, Korean, the immigrant church, Lutheran churches. We will feed them by taking turns. So it's all very cooperative endeavor.
What advice would you give to a missionary that wanted to come to the United States and be a missionary in the U.S.? What advice would you give to them?
They are continually doing so. I think that the important thing is that the missionary in America, I think there's so many ethnic minorities in America that we can still absorb quite a few missionaries to their role. The problem is not so much, I find, I'm talking about current situation, of workers. And the scripture says, harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Among the Korean immigrant pastoral situation, I find that the statement should rather be revised to say, the harvest is plentiful and the laborers are adequate, but the resources are few. So what does that mean? How do we resource this potential mission? And we learned in a bitter way. In earlier days, we kept producing pastors, Lutheran pastors, certified, and yet when they go into the field with empty hands, and their need to feed themselves and their family, as well as expense of working and with no funding, was not easy. So many failed. But then we began to encourage them and say, okay, we have to be prepared to be the tent-making minister. So today, most of the pastorate here is tent-making ministry. On the other hand, what really greatly assists and help in succeeding in this tent-making ministry is that connection with the local congregation. Good example would be like a Texas district, like Dr. Hennings, under the leadership, many of the Korean immigrant pastors who are certified for Missouri Synod is integrated with the local congregations who perhaps have a little bit extra means to support. The most important support is the place of worship, that if they allow, they share the sanctuary so that this ethnic church can go in there and hold the worship service there. But if beyond that, of course, is kind of a seed money to get them started, so that by the time few years pass, and then their membership that is gathered will in turn support and establish their own budget. Well, at the time, whenever I face those challenges, difficult times, I remember what I ended up saying is, Lord, Lord, why me? Kind of a self-pity, and don't understand, and there's no answers right away. So foresight is very poor. What will happen even? But then only when I look back to 20, 30, and even 50 years back, then I suddenly see that all these jigsaw puzzles, like a mosaic pieces that is thrown on the floor, and I say, what is this mess? Why am I in this mess? Those pieces all come together and make a beautiful picture. And when I see that beautiful picture emerging out of that scrambled, the mosaic pieces, then I say, God knows what he's doing. He is such a great salvage operator. All the broken pieces, put it back together again. And with that is comforting thing to me. And that gives me assurance that no matter what I do, in immediate, the problem is not failure. It is only a process through which God works in his salvage work. And I like to think that that is also theological truth, that we human beings are only good at breaking things up, messing things up. But God is the one who is uninvited by human, yet insisting in intervening in our salvage operation, rescue operation, uninvited. Nevertheless, he comes. And that to me is nothing else but humbling thought, such a gracious God.
Well, it seems to me that God rescued your life so that he could bring you here to the United States to start a mission field among Koreans in Los Angeles, New York, Texas, and other places in this country. You are a gift from God, Professor Moon, and we thank God for him bringing you, from preserving your life and for bringing you here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a great joy to realize that God never forsakes us and that he will use us even if we are inadequate, broken pieces in our own ways, and yet whenever his hand touches, it becomes a beautiful vessel for God's gospel and mission work.